Sir, I'm going to need you to adjust your grip. You're in violation of FM 3-23.35, Chapter 4, Paragraph 9. That's what 26-year-old Kyle Nesbitt said to a 77-year-old man named Donald Rains, in front of a classroom full of retired veterans who had more combat time between them than Nesbitt had years on Earth. Donald didn't argue. He didn't adjust his grip. He looked at the young instructor the way a man looks at a clock that's running 3 minutes fast. Not angry, not amused, just aware of a small error that nobody else has noticed yet. What happened next turned that classroom into the quietest room on Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and by the end of the day, Kyle Nesbitt would understand something about manuals, about authority, and about the distance between reading a thing and knowing it, that no certification course had ever taught him. If that kind of moment speaks to you, type respect in the comments right now and stay with me. Donald Rains lived in a single-story brick house on the east side of Lawton, Oklahoma, 6 miles from the main gate of Fort Sill. The house had a chain-link fence around a yard that was more dirt than grass, a concrete bird bath that hadn't held water since his wife Eleanor died 4 years ago, and a detached garage where he kept a 1997 Chevrolet Silverado and a steel workbench that was older than most of the soldiers on post. He was not a tall man, 5'8" in the boots he still wore every day, Red Wing Irish setters with soles he'd resoled twice, but he carried himself with a kind of structural certainty that made people look twice. His posture was the first thing anyone noticed. Yet not stiff, not military parade rigid, but aligned, as though every vertebra in his spine had been informed of its responsibilities and taken them seriously. His hands were square and blunt, the fingers slightly thickened at the second knuckle from decades of work that most people never see and fewer understand. There was a scar on his right thumb, a clean crescent from the base of the nail to the first joint that he'd gotten in 1986 from the charging handle of a weapon that most people outside the Marine Corps have never heard of. He never talked about it. He never talked about most things. His mornings began at 5:30 with a pot of coffee, brewed in a drip machine that Eleanor had bought at a Walmart in Quantico, Virginia, in 2009, and that he refused to replace, because the replacement would mean admitting she was gone in one more small, irreversible way. He drank 2 cups standing at the kitchen window, watching the light come across the Oklahoma plain, and then he did what he had done every morning for 53 years. He went to work. The work had changed over the decades. It used to be rifles and doctrine and the precise, unforgiving mechanics of teaching men how to shoot, move, and fight. Now it was the Lawton Veterans Resource Center, where he volunteered 3 days a week, helping younger veterans navigate disability claims and employment applications. But the discipline was the same. The attention was the same. The hands, those square, scarred, impossibly steady hands, were the same. And the thing about Donald Rains that nobody at the Resource Center knew, that nobody in Lawton knew except perhaps one retired colonel in Virginia who still sent a Christmas card every December, was that those hands had shaped something far larger than any single weapon or any single classroom. Those hands had written words that were read by every soldier and Marine who picked up a service rifle anywhere in the United States military, and those words were about to walk back into Donald's life in a way that nobody in that building at Fort Sill could have predicted. The firearms safety course was held in Building 4217, a cinder block classroom annex on the southeast edge of Fort Sill's cantonment area. The building had been constructed in the early 1980s for overflow instructional use, and it looked exactly like what it was, a government structure built to a budget, with fluorescent tube lighting that buzzed at a frequency that made your fillings ache, linoleum floors the colour of old mustard, and folding tables arranged in a U-shape facing a podium and a projection screen. The walls were painted the particular shade of off-white that exists nowhere in nature and only in federal buildings, and someone had hung a poster near the door showing the 4 fundamental rules of firearm safety in block letters with clip art illustrations that looked like they'd been designed in 1998, which they probably had. The course was part of a post-level initiative to offer refresher firearm safety certification to retired veterans who used the Fort Sill recreational shooting range. The range had updated its access requirements 6 months earlier, and anyone who wanted to continue using it needed to complete an 8-hour classroom block and a live-fire qualification. The requirement applied regardless of rank, regardless of service history, regardless of how many years the veteran had spent carrying, cleaning, firing, repairing, or teaching the very weapons the course was designed to address. It was the kind of policy that made perfect sense on paper and almost no sense in practice, but it was post policy, and post policy was not negotiable. 14 veterans had signed up for the Tuesday session. They ranged in age from 58 to 81. Between them, they held a combined total of 312 years of military service. They included a retired Army Ranger who had done 5 deployments to Afghanistan, a retired Navy chief who had qualified expert with every weapon in the surface warfare inventory, 2 retired Air Force Security Forces NCOs, and Donald Raines, retired Master Gunnery Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, 31 years of service, last duty station Marine Corps Base Quantico, Weapons Training Battalion. None of them wanted to be there. All of them understood why they had to be, but not a single one of them expected what was about to happen in that classroom, because not a single one of them knew that the young man standing behind the podium was about to try to teach Donald Raines how to hold a rifle by reading him his own words. The instructor's name was Kyle Nesbitt. He was 26 years old, held a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Oklahoma State, SISTL, and had been working as a civilian firearms safety instructor under contract to Fort Sill's Directorate of Family and Morale, Welfare and Recreation for 14 months. He had completed the NRA Range Safety Officer certification, the Army Civilian Marksmanship Program Instructor qualification, and a 40-hour Train the Trainer course at the National Guard Professional Education Center. He had never served in the military. This was not, in itself, a problem. Civilian instructors taught on military installations across the country, and many of them were excellent. Professionals with deep knowledge, practical experience, and the humility to understand that a classroom certification and a combat deployment are 2 different kinds of education. Kyle Nesbitt was not one of those instructors. He was competent. He knew the material. He could recite chapter and paragraph from the field manuals the way a law student can cite case numbers, accurately, fluently, and without any real understanding of the blood and chaos that produced them. He had a habit of standing with his feet shoulder-width apart and his hands clasped behind his back, a posture he had adopted after watching a documentary about Marine drill instructors, and he addressed the class with a cadence that was 3 degrees too formal for a room full of men who had heard real authority and knew the difference between the thing and the imitation. He was not arrogant. That would come later, and it would be subtle rather than deliberate. He was earnest. He believed in what he was teaching. He believed the manual was the manual, the standard was the standard, and that his job was to enforce both with consistency and without exception. The problem was that he had never stood in front of a room where the students knew more than the teacher, and the bigger problem, the one that was going to make this day unforgettable for everyone in Building 4217, was that he had never considered the possibility that the manual he was treating as scripture had been written by a human being, and that the human being might be sitting 12 feet away from him in a folding chair, drinking coffee from a paper cup, and waiting with the patience of a man who had been waiting for things his entire life. The first 2 hours of the course went fine. Nesbitt covered the 4 fundamental safety rules, the range communication protocol, the ceasefire procedures, and the medical emergency response plan. The veterans listened. Some took notes. The retired ranger, a man named Hector Salinas, 61, broad-shouldered with a ranger tab tattooed on his forearm, sat with his arms crossed and his chin down, a posture that could have been attention or sleep and was probably both. Donald sat in the second row, slightly off-centre, with his coffee cup on the table in front of him and a single pen beside it. He hadn't written anything down. He hadn't asked a question. He'd nodded once, at the beginning, when Nesbitt correctly described the sequence for a hot-range emergency ceasefire. That nod was the only indication he'd given that he was listening at all. The trouble started at 10:15 during the weapons handling block. Nesbitt transitioned from the slide presentation to a practical demonstration, using a red-handled training replica of the M4 carbine. He walked through the standard grip, the cheek weld, the trigger finger placement, and the support hand positioning, citing the relevant manual paragraphs for each technique. He was precise, he was by the book, and he was slightly, critically, specifically wrong about one thing. When he described the support hand placement on the handguard, he cited FM 3-23.35, Chapter 4, Paragraph 9, and demonstrated a grip that positioned the support elbow directly beneath the weapon, a technique that was correct for the M16A2 platform, but had been specifically revised for the M4 in the 2008 update to account for the carbon's shorter handguard and different balance point. The revision, Paragraph 9, subsection C, added in the 2008 edition and carried forward into every subsequent version, called for a modified support position with the elbow angled slightly outward to accommodate the compact platform. It was a small difference, 3 inches of elbow position. The kind of detail that mattered only when it mattered, which was to say when someone was actually shooting, under stress, at a target that was shooting back. Donald noticed it the way he noticed everything, quietly, completely, and without any outward indication that anything was wrong. He didn't say a word. He took a sip of his coffee and set the cup down. Nesbitt continued his demonstration. He moved through the class, observing each veteran as they practiced the grip sequence with the training replicas distributed from a storage case along the wall. He offered corrections, some valid, some unnecessary, most delivered with the tone of a man who was confused knowing the page number with knowing the subject. The retired Navy chief adjusted his grip without comment. The Air Force NCOs complied with small, tight smiles. Hector Salinas looked at Nesbitt with an expression that could have curdled paint but said nothing. Then Nesbitt reached Donald. Donald was holding the training replica with his left hand positioned exactly where 53 years of experience had taught him it should be. Elbow angled out, thumb wrapped over the top of the handguard, fingers applying rearward pressure against the handguard's texture, the weapon balanced between his hands like it was part of his skeleton. It was the grip described in paragraph 9, subsection C, the correct grip. The grip that Donald knew was correct because he had written the sentence that described it. In a windowless office at Quantico, at a steel desk, with a cup of coffee that his wife Eleanor had brought him at 2100 because he'd been working since 0600 and hadn't eaten dinner, in March of 2008, during the revision cycle that updated the field manual from the A2 platform to the M4 platform. Nesbitt looked at Donald's grip. He frowned. "Sir," he said, "I'm going to need you to adjust your support hand. Your elbow is flared. FM 3-23.35. Chapter 4, paragraph 9 specifies the elbow directly beneath the weapon for a stable firing platform." The room was not yet quiet. 2 other veterans were still handling their replicas. Someone coughed, but something shifted. The retired ranger, Hector Salinas, uncrossed his arms. The Navy chief set his replica down and turned to watch. They could feel it. The veterans in that room, men who had spent their lives in environments where the wrong word at the wrong moment could change everything, could feel the air in Building 4217 change the way the air changes before a storm, not because of the wind, but because of the silence that comes before it. Donald looked at Nesbitt. He didn't look up. They were nearly the same height, with Donald seated and Nesbitt standing. He looked across. His eyes were steady, not hostile, not offended, just present, in the full weight of that word, with a calm that came from a place Nesbitt had never been and couldn't recognize. "Say that paragraph number again," Donald said. His voice was quiet, even. The voice of a man who has given 10,000 instructions in his life, and has learned that volume is the last resort of someone who doesn't know what he's talking about. Nesbitt straightened slightly. FM 3-23.35, Chapter 4, Paragraph 9. Support hand placement for the standard firing grip. Donald nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when he's confirming something to himself rather than agreeing with someone else. "Do you have a copy of the manual?" he asked. Nesbitt gestured toward the podium where a thick ring-bound manual sat beside his laptop. "Right there." "May I?" Donald stood. He walked to the podium with the same deliberate, unhurried gait he used everywhere. Not the walk of an old man compensating for bad joints, but the walk of a man who has never once in his life needed to rush because he has always been exactly where he needed to be, exactly when he needed to be there. He picked up the manual. He held it the way he held everything, firmly, with the care of someone who understands that the thing in his hands has weight beyond its physical mass. He opened it. Not to Chapter 4, not to paragraph 9. He opened it to the back, to the appendix, to a page that Kyle Nesbitt had probably never read, because it wasn't part of the instructional content, because it wasn't on the test, because it was just a list of names in small type on a page that most people skipped on their way to the index, the revision history. The page that listed every update, every amendment, every modification made to the manual since its original publication, along with the names of the review board members who authorized each change. Donald found the entry he was looking for. He turned the manual around and set it on the podium, open, facing Nesbitt. He put his finger, his right index finger, the one with the scar from the charging handle, on a single line of text. "Read that," he said. The room was silent. Not the passive silence of people who aren't talking, but the active silence of 14 men who have stopped breathing because they know something is happening that cannot be undone and should not be interrupted. Nesbitt looked down at the page. The entry was dated March 2008. It read, Chapter 4, Paragraph 9, Revised. Support hand placement specifications updated to reflect M4 carbine platform ergonomics. Modified elbow positioning guidance added, subsection C. Review Board, Lieutenant Colonel R.K. Farnham, USMC, Master Gunnery Sergeant D.R. Rains, USMC, Chief Warrant Officer 3 P.M. Albrecht, USMC. Nesbitt read it. Then he read it again. His eyes moved from the page to Donald's finger, from the finger to Donald's face. The face hadn't changed. It was the same face that had walked into the classroom 2 hours ago, weathered, patient, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. But now Nesbitt knew, or at least he was beginning to know, which is a different and more uncomfortable thing, because beginning to know means understanding that you didn't know before, and understanding that you didn't know means reckoning with everything you did while you were ignorant. "I wrote that paragraph," Donald said. His voice hadn't changed either. Same volume, same cadence, same unshakable evenness. And you're reading it wrong. Paragraph 9, base text, describes the support hand placement for the M16A2 platform. Subsection C, added in the 2008 revision, modifies that placement for the M4 carbine to account for the shorter handguard length and the shift in the weapon's centre of gravity. The elbow goes out, not under. 3 inches of clearance at the joint. I wrote the sentence. I tested the position. I fired 400 rounds through a carbine in one afternoon to validate the change before the review board would sign off on it. My shoulder didn't work right for a week. He paused. Not for effect, for accuracy. The grip I was using when you corrected me is the grip described in the subsection you didn't read. It's the correct grip for the platform you're teaching. And if you're going to cite the manual to this room, he let his gaze move across the 14 veterans, each of whom was watching him with an expression that ranged from quiet satisfaction to something that looked like reverence. Then cite the whole manual. Nesbitt stood behind the podium with the manual open in front of him, and his hands at his sides and his face cycling through a sequence of expressions that, in a less painful moment, might have been interesting to catalogue. Surprise, confusion, embarrassment, and finally a kind of blank stillness that was either shock or the beginning of something more useful. The room remained silent. Nobody rescued him. Nobody cracked a joke to ease the tension. This was not a room of people who believed in easing tension. This was a room of people who had lived inside tension for years and decades, and understood that the discomfort of a corrected mistake was not something to be softened, but something to be sat with until it taught you what it came to teach. Hector Salinas, the retired ranger, broke the silence. Not with words. He picked up his training replica, adjusted his support hand to match Donald's grip, elbow out, thumb over the handguard, fingers applying rearward pressure, and held the weapon up in a way that was half demonstration and half salute. The Navy chief did the same, then one of the Air Force NCOs, then another. Within 30 seconds, every veteran in the room was holding a training replica with the grip described in paragraph 9, subsection C, the grip written by the man standing at the podium, the grip that Kyle Nesbitt had been teaching incorrectly for 14 months. Donald watched them. Something moved behind his eyes. Not pride exactly, though there was pride in it, and not sadness, though there was sadness too. It was the look of a man who has spent his life building something in silence, and has just watched it appear in a room full of strangers who didn't know his name 5 minutes ago, but who know, in the way that soldiers always know, that the thing they are holding in their hands was shaped by the hands of the man in front of them. Donald stepped away from the podium. He walked back to his seat, picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it down again. He sat. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The correction had been made, not with anger, not with humiliation, but with the precision of a man who corrects things the way he does everything else, completely, specifically, and with just enough force to set the record straight without breaking the person who got it wrong. Nesbitt remained at the podium. He looked at the manual, he looked at the room. He closed the manual, set it on the podium, and for a long moment appeared to be deciding something. Then he picked the manual back up, opened it to the appendix and began reading the revision history, not aloud, not for the class, but for himself, running his finger down the list of names and dates the way a student reads the acknowledgements section of a textbook for the first time and realizes that the book didn't write itself. He read for 2 full minutes. Nobody interrupted him. When he was done, he closed the manual again and set it down with a care he hadn't shown before, as though the object had changed in his hands, which in a sense it had. It was no longer just a reference document, it was the work product of a man sitting 12 feet away, who had just demonstrated that the distance between recitation and understanding is the same distance between knowing a paragraph number and knowing what the paragraph means. Nesbitt looked at Donald. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Rains," he said. He used the full rank. He used it correctly. He didn't stumble over it or compress it the way civilians sometimes do. "I owe this class an apology, and I owe you a correction. You're right. Subsection C modifies the base paragraph for the M4 platform, and I was teaching the A2 standard without the carbine amendment." He paused. "I'd like to continue the course, if that's acceptable, and if you're willing, I'd appreciate your input on any other areas where I might be, where the instruction might not reflect the current revision." It was a good recovery. Not perfect. Nothing about this day was going to be perfect for Kyle Nesbitt, but good. He had done the thing that most people in his position cannot do. He had been publicly wrong in front of people whose respect he wanted, and instead of retreating into defensiveness or false authority, he had absorbed the hit, acknowledged the error, and asked for help. Donald looked at him for a long moment. Then he gave a single nod, the same nod he'd given at the beginning of the class when Nesbitt had correctly described the ceasefire sequence. The nod meant, "That's right, keep going." The rest of the morning passed differently. Nesbitt continued teaching, but the quality of the instruction changed in ways that were subtle and significant. He stopped citing paragraph numbers. He stopped using the manual as a shield. He taught from the material, not from the page, and when he reached a point where he wasn't sure, the transition from the classroom weapons handling block to the range communication procedures, he paused, looked at Donald and said, "Master Gunnery Sergeant, is there anything you'd add here?" Donald said, "The manual covers the verbal commands, but it doesn't cover the timing. On a live range with experienced shooters, the interval between ready on the left and ready on the right needs to be long enough for the last man in the line to confirm his lane, but short enough to keep the firing line's concentration intact. 3 seconds. Not 2, not 5. 3. Nesbitt wrote it down. He wrote it in the margin of his manual, in blue ink next to the paragraph that covered range commands, and the act of writing in the margin, of treating the manual as a living document rather than a finished product, was perhaps the most important thing he did all day, the veterans noticed. Hector Salinas unfolded his arms for the first time all morning. The Navy chief asked a question, a real question, not a challenge, about the differences between Army and Navy range protocol, and Nesbitt answered it honestly, said he didn't know the Navy side, and looked at the chief, who explained it in 30 seconds. The class became a conversation, not a free-for-all, not a bull session, but a structured exchange between a young instructor who was learning in real time that humility is not weakness, and 14 men who were remembering that teaching is not about who has the most knowledge, but about who is willing to share it. During the lunch break, Nesbitt found Donald in the hallway outside the classroom. Donald was standing by a window, looking out at the artillery range to the north where a battery was conducting live-fire training, the dull percussion of howitzer rounds carrying across the flat Oklahoma landscape like distant thunder. Nesbitt stood beside him for a moment without speaking, then he said, "Can I ask you something?" Donald didn't turn from the window. "Go ahead." "How long were you at Quantico?" 8 years, last duty station, weapons training battalion. I ran the marksmanship instructor school for the last 3 of those years, and sat on the doctrinal review board for the last 5. Nesbitt was quiet. Then, "What was the hardest part?" Donald turned from the window. He looked at Nesbitt with an expression that was curious and careful, the expression of a man deciding how much truth someone is ready for. "The hardest part of what? Of writing the manual, the doctrine? How do you put something like that into words? Something that's about feel, about instinct, about what your body does when your brain is too busy to think?" Donald looked at him for a long time, long enough that the silence became its own answer, or at least its own question. Then he said, You don't put instinct into words, you put mechanics into words. The grip, the stance, the trigger press, the breathing. Those are mechanical actions, and they can be described with precision. What you can't write is the 10,000 repetitions that turn mechanics into instinct. That's the part the manual can't teach. That's the part the instructor has to teach. And the instructor can only teach it if he's done the repetitions himself. He paused. You're a good instructor, Nesbit. You know the material. You present it clearly. You care about getting it right, which is more than half the battle. But you're teaching mechanics from a page. You need to teach mechanics from your hands. Go to the range, not as an instructor, as a student. Shoot 1,000 rounds with the M4 platform. Feel what the subsection describes. Then come back and teach it, and you won't need the paragraph number because the paragraph will be in your body. Nesbit looked at his own hands. They were clean, uncalloused. The hands of a man who handled weapons for demonstration purposes and cleaned them on a schedule and stored them in a rack at the end of the day. He looked at Donald's hands, the scars, the thickened knuckles, the crescent on the right thumb, the hands of a man for whom a weapon was not a teaching aid but an extension of his own nervous system. Something shifted in Nesbit's face, not a dramatic transformation, something quieter. The look of a man who has just understood, for the first time, how far he has to go, and who is not discouraged by the distance but clarified by it. That understanding, the willingness to see the gap between where you are and where you need to be without flinching, was the most important thing Donald Raines taught anyone that day, and he taught it without citing a single paragraph. The afternoon session was the live fire qualification. The class moved from Building 4217 to Range 12, a 25-metre indoor qualification range with 8 firing lanes, concrete walls, and a ventilation system that hummed with the mechanical determination of something that was designed to work under conditions that would make most machines quit. The veterans filed into the range building, drew their assigned weapons from the arms room, standard M4A1 carbines, the same platform the manual addressed, and lined up in the ready area behind the firing line. Donald drew lane 4. He signed the weapons card with the pen from his pocket, the same pen he'd set on the table that morning and hadn't used once during the classroom block. He press-checked the weapon, pulling the charging handle back just far enough to confirm a round was seated, a motion so fast and fluid it was invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, and stepped to the line. Nesbit ran the range. He called the commands with the crisp, cadenced delivery that was the best part of his instruction. His voice was good, clear and carrying, with the right rhythm for a firing line. Shooters, you may load and make ready. 14 veterans loaded their magazines. The sound of 14 bolts going forward filled the range like a single mechanical heartbeat. Ready on the left? Silence, confirmation. Ready on the right? Silence, confirmation. 3 seconds. Exactly 3 seconds. Nesbit had listened. Commence firing. Donald Raines fired his qualification course with the economical precision of a man who had fired this same course, or its equivalent, more times than he could count and more times than anyone watching him could imagine. Each round left the muzzle with the same interval. Each trigger press was identical, smooth, straight to the rear, reset forward to the sear, press again. His support hand was positioned exactly as paragraph 9, subsection C described. Elbow angled out, thumb over the handguard, fingers applying rearward pressure. The weapon didn't move. It didn't shift or wander or drift between shots. It sat in his hands the way a good tool sits in the hands of the man who made it. Brbe. Which was not a metaphor, but a literal description of what was happening, because the technique being applied to the weapon was the technique that the man holding the weapon had codified, tested, validated, and published for the use of every rifleman in the United States military. When the ceasefire was called, Donald safed his weapon, locked the bolt to the rear, and stepped back from the line. His target, a standard qualification silhouette at 25 meters, had a single ragged hole in the center of the scoring zone, not a group. A hole. 40 rounds through the same point of impact, the paper chewed through so completely that the backing cardboard was visible, a tight void in the silhouette's chest that looked less like a shot group and more like something had been removed from the target with a hole punch. Hector Salinas. Firing in lane 5 leaned over to look at Donald's target. He looked at it for several seconds. Then he looked at Donald. Then he said, quietly enough that only Donald and the shooter in lane 3 could hear, "I've seen a lot of shooting, Master Guns. That's the best I've ever seen from a man your age. Donald glanced at him. From a man any age, he said. It wasn't boasting, it was correction. The same kind of correction he'd made at the podium, precise, factual, and delivered without any interest in whether it made him look good or made anyone else feel bad. Nesbitt scored the targets after the qualification was complete. He moved down the line, marking each target with a red pen, tallying the hits inside the scoring rings, recording the results on the qualification sheet. When he reached lane 4, he stopped. He looked at the target. He looked at it the way a person looks at something that doesn't fit inside their existing understanding of what is possible. Not with disbelief, but with the sudden expansion of a boundary they didn't know they had. He marked the target. Perfect score. He wrote the number on the qualification sheet, and then he did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He pulled the target from the frame, carried it to Donald and said, "I'd like to keep this, if you don't mind, to hang in the classroom." Donald looked at the target. A piece of paper with a hole in it. A piece of paper that represented nothing more or less than the physical expression of words he'd written in a manual 18 years ago. The grip, the stance, the breathing, the trigger press, the elbow position. All of it converging in 40 identical moments of applied precision. "Keep it," he said, "but hang the manual page next to it, subsection C, so the next class knows what they're looking at." Nesbitt nodded. He held the target carefully, by the edges, the way you hold something that has just become more than what it was. He walked back to the scoring table, set the target on top of his manual, and for the rest of the qualification, he didn't correct a single veteran's technique. Not because he was intimidated, not because he was defeated, because he had learned something that every good instructor eventually learns, if they're lucky enough to learn it at all, that the best teachers are sometimes sitting in the student chairs, that the manual is a living document written by living hands, and that the gap between knowing a paragraph number and understanding what the paragraph means is a gap that can only be closed by doing the work, firing the rounds, and earning the knowledge the hard way. The course ended at 16:30. The veterans filed out of Building 4 2-on-7 with their qualification cards and their hearing protection slung around their necks and the particular looseness that comes from a day spent doing something physical that you're good at, and that still matters. Hector Salinas caught Donald in the parking lot and shook his hand. Not the polite two-pump handshake of casual acquaintance, but the grip and hold of one professional recognizing another across the boundary of service branches. "Semper Fi, Master Guns," Salinas said, and Donald said, "All the way, Ranger," and neither of them needed to say anything else because the handshake said it, and the day had said it, and the hole in the target had said it louder than any words could. The Navy chief gave Donald a nod from across the lot. The same kind of nod Donald had given Nesbitt that morning, the universal military shorthand for acknowledgement, respect, and the understanding that some things are better left unsaid. Donald walked to his Silverado. The truck was parked at the far end of the lot under a cottonwood tree whose leaves were beginning to turn the brittle gold of Oklahoma autumn. He opened the door, set his range bag on the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel for a moment without starting the engine. He was thinking about the manual. Not the content. He knew the content the way he knew his own name. The way he knew the feel of a trigger brake. The way he knew the smell of carbon and copper and hops number 9. But about the fact that it existed, out there, in classrooms and ready rooms and arms vaults across the country, being read by people who had never met him and never would. He was thinking about the words, his words, written in a windowless office at Quantico, refined through committee and review and field testing, and 400 rounds fired in a single afternoon that left his shoulder aching for a week. Words that described the position of an elbow, the pressure of fingers, the angle of a thumb. Mechanical actions so small and so specific that most people would dismiss them as trivial, and yet those small, specific, trivial actions were the difference between a round that hit its target and a round that didn't. Between a qualification score of 36 and a qualification score of 40. Between a Marine who went home and a Marine who didn't. He thought about Eleanor. She would have liked today. Not the confrontation. Eleanor had never liked confrontation, had spent 34 years of marriage smoothing the edges that Donald's precision sometimes sharpened into points. But the part after. The part where Nesbitt wrote in the margin. The part where the class became a conversation. She would have said, "You see, Don, that's what you're for." And she would have been right, because Eleanor was always right about the things that mattered. which was why the coffee maker from Walmart was still on the counter, and the bird bath in the yard was still empty, and the house was still standing because a man kept standing in it, every morning, at 5:30, drinking coffee and going to work. 2 weeks later, Donald received a letter. Not an email, not a phone call. A letter, handwritten on Fort Sill Directorate of Family and Morale, Welfare and Recreation letterhead. It was from Kyle Nesbitt. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph thanked Donald for attending the course and for the correction regarding subsection C. The second paragraph informed Donald that the qualification target, the one with the single hole, was now framed and hanging on the wall of Building 4217 next to a laminated copy of FM 3-23.35, Chapter 4, Paragraph 9, Subsection C, with a small placard beneath it that read, "Fired by Master Gunnery Sergeant Donald R. Rains, USMC, retired, author of the revision, 40/40. The third paragraph asked if Donald would be willing to serve as a guest instructor for future sessions, not as a student, but as a co-instructor, teaching alongside Nesbitt, bringing the hands and the experience and the 10,000 repetitions that the manual described but could not contain. Donald read the letter standing at the kitchen counter, beside the percolator, in the early light that came through the window and fell across the field manuals stacked on the table. He read it twice. Then he set it on the counter, picked up his pen, the same pen he carried every day, the pen that had sat unused on a folding table in Building 4217, because the man holding it had already written everything that needed to be written. And on the back of the envelope, in handwriting as precise and unhurried as everything else about him, he wrote a single word: yes. He put the letter in his truck and drove to the Veterans Resource Center, where he helped a 24-year-old Marine corporal navigate a disability claim for a shoulder injury sustained during a live fire exercise. The corporal's injury had been caused by improper weapon support. The elbow tucked under instead of angled out, the carbine's recoil transferred directly into the shoulder joint instead of distributed across the skeletal structure, exactly the kind of injury that paragraph 9, subsection C had been written to prevent. Donald didn't mention the manual, he didn't mention the paragraph. He helped the corporal fill out the form, showed him where to sign, and told him to call if the VA gave him trouble. Then he drove home, parked the Silverado under the cottonwood tree, and went inside to make his coffee. The percolator did what it always did. The light did what it always did, and the field manual sat on the table, its pages soft and its spine cracked, its words still true, still working, still keeping people alive in rooms that Donald Rains would never enter, through hands that he would never shake, in the quiet, invisible, permanent way that good work endures, long after the hands that made it have come to rest. If this story reminded you that the people who write the rules we live by are real, that every manual, every regulation, every standard started as one person's knowledge, earned the hard way and written down so that others wouldn't have to learn it the hard way too, then subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories because the men and women who shaped the doctrine didn't do it for credit. They did it because getting it right mattered more than getting the recognition. Share this with someone who served. Comment below if you've ever met someone who knew more than the room realized. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.